Good evening. Good evening. My name is George Belmer. I teach modern British, Irish, and European history at UW, and I will be introducing our main speaker in just a second. I have two brief announcements, bear with me. The first is that there are books for sale in the lobby. Among these books for sale is The Battle of Ottawa, which is one of the very fine books written by our presenter tonight, and Ray Jonas has kindly consented to autograph those books. Now, what incentive? So the books will be for sale in the lobby. And secondly, as you walked in today, you should have received a card. On this card, assuming you have a pen or a pencil, you are very welcome to write down, jot down notes about Ray's talk, and if there is time, there may not be enough time for all the questions, but if there will be 10, 12 minutes after the end of Ray's lecture when he can field those questions. So use your cards to good account. I'm honored to be introducing Professor Raymond Jonas tonight. He's our featured historian, I suppose you'd say. He came to the University of Washington in 1985, and ever since that time, he has been a mainstay of the Department of History's European contingent. He has been a prolific scholar, publishing 5 books, numerous articles and essays, and he has also contributed meaningfully to the emerging field of digital history. Ray's scholarship is remarkably wide-ranging, delving as it does into the lives of French peasants, the formation of religious cults, the resistance of African peoples to European colonialism and other subjects. And precisely because his interests are so broad, so Catholic with a small c, Ray's teaching possesses a sweep that enlivens all his lectures. His undergraduates praise Ray's classroom engagement. Now, I must confess to you that I do not regard as holy script the words that come to us from ratemyprofessor.com, one of the most dubious websites on the web. But in Ray's case, the applause is richly merited. His lectures are, and I'm quoting here, very compelling, really passionate, sometimes even, I'm not making this up, spectacular. Mind you, Ray is no light touch. As one student surveyed puts it, skip class, you won't pass. Sounds like something from the O.J. Simpson trial. Ray's admirers, moreover, include the chronologically seasoned, which I accept as one of my own designations, I suppose. Quoting still from ratemyprofessor.com, one learns that Ray has this like entourage of old people who love him so much they take every course he offers, unquote. So, having now set the performance bar impossibly high, I welcome Professor Ray Jonas, who will speak to us about power and privilege in the French Revolution. Bonne chance, Ray.
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. I think I'll have to wait for another occasion to take revenge. Last week, we heard my colleague Richard Johnson tell us about the American Revolution. Tonight, our topic is the French Revolution, and what better way to get there than to follow that great American rebel Ben Franklin across the Atlantic. That's what I propose we do tonight. Follow Franklin to France, where, unlike Franklin, we'll stay in order to witness some of the events of the Revolution. Toward the end of our time, we'll return back across the Atlantic, not to the US, but to the Caribbean, to Haiti, where we'll witness the Haitian Revolution before concluding with some reflections on these three Atlantic revolutions. So let's gather around Ben. Franklin made the Atlantic crossing 7 times in his life. So it's not difficult to imagine him as he's pictured here, sometime after his 6th crossing, in his coonskin cap and simple wool jacket. Franklin's mission was to secure French support for the American cause of independence. That mission was greatly aided by the chance circumstance that his visit coincided with a French fashion craze for rustic simplicity. Franklin embodied the current vogue for authenticity, a popularization of the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Franklin's learned simplicity contrasted sharply with the artifice of the court at Versailles. Whether we credit diplomacy, astute timing, or sartorial novelty, by March of 1778, Franklin had what he wanted: a treaty of alliance with France, a treaty without which victory for the American colonies is difficult to imagine. The thought of a monarchy supporting an embryonic republic may seem odd. But for France, the gesture was something like a modern proxy war, as much about causing mischief and grief for Britain as anything else. I mention all of this not just to get us from the Revolution of 1776 to the Revolution of 1789, but also as a way to point out that the French Revolution, far from starting with an uprising in the streets, began with a financial crisis. 8 years after the Treaty of Alliance, the French crown was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. 4 wars in the 18th century, the most recent being the war in support of the independence of the American colonies, had brought ruin. In 1786, the maintenance of the debt alone would consume about half the anticipated revenue for the year. More borrowing was out of the question, and bankruptcy would only ruin France's credit. It meant that the monarchy would have to do something absolute monarchies aren't supposed to have to do, namely, appeal to the authority of public opinion. By 1788, Louis was forced to call upon representatives of the nation, organized into 3 estates or orders: clergy, nobility, and commons, or third estate. This body, known as the Estates General, convened at Versailles in May of 1789 with the expectation that it would do what it was told to do: approve tax reform and go home. Instead, it accomplished a revolution. The process snagged immediately over the archaic system of organizing the nation into orders and giving the 2 privileged orders, clergy and nobility, representation equal to that of the Third Estate, which represented some 98% of the population. Even the rituals of power were haunted by antiquated rules. The clergy, the members of the First Estate, took precedence in the procession of the estates and were seated in the hall in the place of honor, that is, on the king's right. The nobility, the Second Estate, followed the clergy in procession and sat on the king's left, and the lowly third brought up the rear and sat in the back of the hall. Within days, the Third Estate had bolted, taking a revolutionary path. It renamed itself the National Assembly and, in a reversal, invited the clergy and the nobility to join it. Liberal members of the clergy and nobility began to do just that, and in fact, by the third week of June of 1789, a majority of the clergy had joined the National Assembly. So Louis was losing control of events. He rejected advice from his advisors, including the Queen, to use force. Instead, he announced his intention to speak to the estates, to use words and his own royal presence to coax them back into line in order to halt any further progress until his speech. And he ordered the meeting hall of the assembly closed. The next morning, when the representatives of the assembly found their meeting place locked, they feared the worst, a royal coup against the National Assembly, and they were outraged. They proceeded to a nearby building large enough to hold them, in fact, an indoor tennis court, and got to work. They drafted an oath, read it aloud, and swore to be bound by it, without distinction of rank or privilege. This oath, remembered as the tennis court oath, reiterated their commitment to work as a national assembly, to draft a constitution for the realm. And they took care to point out that they would maintain the true principles of monarchy, but in fact, it was a revolution. Eventually, an exasperated King Louis ordered the holdouts among clergy and nobility to join the work of the National Assembly and to begin the work of drafting a constitution. By late June of 1789, the revolution seemed to be over. At least that was the opinion of Arthur Young, an Englishman who'd been visiting France for months. On the 27th of June, Young wrote in his journal, "The whole business now seems over, and the revolution complete." He left Paris the next day without an inkling of what was to come. The revolution might have ended there, dramatic, certainly, but relatively bloodless. Imagine that. It would have meant a peaceful transition from absolutism to constitutional monarchy. The whole thing over in a matter of weeks. It would have meant no tricolor flag, no sans-culotte, no Marseillaise, no guillotine, and no terror. Even key personalities might have gone missing. Without a prolonged revolution, there might be no Maximilien Robespierre and no Napoleon, at least not with the notoriety that they hold today. But to imagine the revolution complete in June of 1789 begs the question, what drove the revolution forward? Part of the answer takes us into the realm of the history of gossip and rumor. In early July 1789, the rumor was that the king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, were plotting to turn back the revolution and recover their power. There were rumors of troops being called up to Versailles to crush the revolution and to Paris to intimidate good patriots. There were rumors of a plot to starve Paris as grain prices reached a record high. In Paris, the king's decision to dismiss a popular liberal minister, the Swiss Protestant banker Jacques Necker, was taken as a signal that the royal counter-revolution was beginning. The people were warned to arm themselves. The morning of the 14th of July, tens of thousands marched on the garrison at the Invalides to seize weapons. Thousands also marched on the Bastille where it was rumored that they would find still more weapons and ammunition. By the end of the day, the Bastille was in the hands of the insurrection, the people were armed, and the revolution was saved. This cycle of provocation, rumor, and insurrection played out repeatedly over the early years of the revolution, and it had an incalculable effect on its course. In fact, it helps us to understand the significant advantage that the American Revolution enjoyed in that once independence was won, the old regime and its agents left the territory and withdrew to a safer move, that is, back across the Atlantic. George III was not party to what followed American independence. For the French Revolution, though, all the key players remained. King, queen, nobility, though, of course, in much diminished roles. The success of the revolution demanded that they accept those roles ungrudgingly. And the fact that they didn't, and showed that they didn't, goes a long way toward explaining the psychological and emotional climate of mistrust that built and would, in time, underpin the terror. The events leading to the seizure of the Bastille on 14 July were one such example. Another would occur just a few months later, in October of 1789. Troops from the province of Flanders were called to Versailles. They were said to be particularly devoted to the royal couple and to the cause of monarchy. When they arrived, the royal guard hosted a banquet for them in the stunning opera hall at Versailles. Toward the end of the evening, after many toasts, the king and queen appeared with their son. The soldiers gave them an ovation, after which the blue, white, and red tricolor, that's the symbol of the new nation, was trampled underfoot and replaced with black cockades, the color of the queen. It was not only was this an insult to the revolution, it revealed where the soldiers' loyalties would lie in the event of a confrontation. When the news of this insult reached Paris, it was taken as a proof of a conspiracy against the revolution, especially as the king for weeks had put off signing important legislation passed by the National Assembly in August, including the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a document that made explicit the principles of the new order, including legal equality and the abolition of privilege. On the 5th of October, a crowd of women, at least 5,000, gathered in front of the Hôtel de Ville, that is, the town hall in Paris. They talked of going to Versailles to speak directly with the king. Later that morning, they set out from Paris to Versailles on foot, a walk that would take most of the day. They remained overnight and in the morning insisted that the king end his foot dragging, sign the legislation, and accompany the women back to Paris. The royal couple complied, and along with the National Assembly, they joined the long procession from Versailles to the city of Paris, where they took up residence in the Tuileries Palace. Across the Channel, the Women's March on Versailles so troubled Edmund Burke that it inspired him to write his reflections on the revolution in France, the first systematic statement of conservative ideology for the modern era. And meanwhile, the implicit feminism of the Women's March made it a signal event in the history of women's rights. Articulated in France by Olympe de Gouges and in Britain by Mary Wollstonecraft. The revolution was barely 5 months old, and it was already laying down markers. Let me tell you about one more episode in the dynamic of counter-revolutionary conspiracy and revolutionary rumor and insurrection. It erupted spectacularly in June of 1791 when the royal family sought to flee the country, caricatured mockingly here by a cartoonist who shows them using the sewer as an escape tunnel and getting caught in the scatological crossfire. The king and queen would later reveal that ever since the women had brought the royal family to Paris, they felt trapped. Their flight, they thought, would restore their freedom, but it nearly ignited civil war. Their plan was to flee eastward to what was then the Austrian Netherlands, that is, to territory ruled by the Queen's family. The royal family succeeded in exiting Paris sometime after midnight on the 20th of June, but their massive coach drew attention along the road to the east. It's not easy to travel incognito when your profile is on every coin of the realm. And it's even harder when you insist on getting out of the coach at every stop for fresh horses. They were identified at various points and were finally arrested at a place called Varennes. It's mere hours, in fact, from the eastern frontier. The royal family was escorted back to Paris under very heavy security. At a blow, the solid work of institutionalizing the gains of the revolution was upset. The Marquis de Lafayette and others, in fact, tried to save the king and the Constitution by promoting the fiction that the king had not tried to flee. He had been abducted. However laughable this may seem, in retrospect, it shows us how desperate was the desire to salvage the Constitution, to prevent the revolution from lurching forward again. The Assembly, in fact, accepted this stratagem, despite massive demonstrations calling the flight not an abduction, but an abdication. The monarchy limped along for another year, and the flight to Varennes, as it was remembered, shattered any realistic hope of saving the king and the queen as partners in the new constitution, creating a constitutional monarchy. Even worse, the flight to Varennes emboldened purveyors of the most extravagant claims, who now stoked the deepest fears of the people, and did so for political gain. Even the absurd ravings of Jean-Paul Marat, who called for hundreds of heads to defeat the counter-revolution, no longer seemed quite so absurd. Prior to the attempted flight, Marat had used his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, to warn of an imminent royal flight. But now the most fanciful claims were given credit. Truth, rumor, gossip, false news became more difficult to disentangle. The fact that the king and queen so visibly opposed the revolution impeded its institutionalization. And without consolidation and institutionalization, the revolution could never enter a post-revolutionary phase. The challenge of governing overlay the challenge of bringing the revolution to a close. Every issue seemed laden. Every issue carried the burden of governing. In fact, every issue seemed to call into question the gains of the revolution. Every act of opposition could be construed as treason. So the Constitution was always at risk, the revolution always at stake. The motives of political actors were always in doubt. In such an environment, political opposition was never just a matter of disagreement. In fact, it threatened to spill over into counter-revolution. The mirror image of the royal family's counter-revolutionary subversion was the militant revolutionary, the sans-culottes. These were practical men, tradesmen, skilled workers, whose preference for pants, rather than the silk knee breeches worn by men of wealth and station, derived from the demands of their livelihood. They wore practical clothing, the practical clothing of a laborer. In politics, they represented the rank and file of the revolution, the men who risked their lives to fight the counter-revolution at every turn, at the Bastille, on the march to Versailles, where some of them had accompanied their wives, mothers, and daughters. If they were necessary at these moments to save the revolution, their persistence stood in the way of the consolidation of the revolution, for, in a sense, they embodied direct democracy. That is to say, the people themselves, in the face of an assembly whose status was merely representative and therefore derivative. In the aftermath of the royal family's failed flight, the sans-culottes answered the call for constant vigilance, which amounted to a state of permanent revolution, a concept that would inspire Leon Trotsky in 1917. As part of an attempt to save the monarchy, a leading faction of the assembly began to push France toward war, guided by the thought that war might yet unite a divided nation. War would give Louis a chance to prove his loyalty, cast in doubt by his flight. And war against kings and queens would give revolutionary France a common, unifying, and external goal, namely, to rid Europe of despotism. This last point is crucial because it reveals the evangelical impulse of those who argued for war. France's war would be a war of liberation, toppling thrones and freeing people from tyranny. It was a new concept of war. War not in a spirit of conquest, a war not even of self-defense, but a redemptive war driven by altruism. It was a concept, in fact, with a very long future, the mother of all wars of nation building and the ancestor of every civilizing mission. Jacques-Pierre Brissot and a group later known as the Girondins used the issue of patriotic war to rise to national prominence and to dominate the politics of the assembly. Maximilien Robespierre, whatever his faults, was almost alone in seeing the risk. In early January 1792, he spoke against the war with deep conviction, and he punctured the vision of French armies liberating Europe. The most extravagant idea, he said, that can be born in the head of a politician is to believe that it suffices for a people to come, weapons in hand, among a foreign people and expect to have its laws and constitution embraced. And he concluded with these prophetic words, "No one loves armed missionaries." Just the same, on the 20th of April, 1792, the Assembly voted to declare war not on Austria, but on its ruler, the Habsburg king Francis II, a formulation that took pains to distinguish king from people. In taking on Francis II, who, by the way, was the brother of the Queen, Marie Antoinette, the French armies could claim to be taking on a tyrant on behalf of the people he tyrannized. But the war would put at risk everything that the revolution had gained. For Louis and Marie Antoinette, that was exactly the point. They vigorously promoted the war with the expectation that it was a war that France would lose. And a defeat for revolutionary France would mean a defeat for the revolution. The nobility had dominated the officer corps. Nobles, in fact, had been emigrating since July of 1789. Some, in fact, had joined the counter-revolution abroad. Louis was convinced that without their officers, French armies would be routed easily in battle. And the Queen, always vivid in her language, wrote to a friend, "The fools, can't they see that this is helping us?" In fact, Louis and Marie Antoinette would be among the first casualties of the war. Austrian and Prussian forces mobilized at the frontier and prepared to invade French territory. The French Assembly passed legislation calling provincial National Guard units to join the army in defense of the country. But rather than sign this legislation into law as the Constitution required, Louis stalled. It was said, and it was readily believed, that the king was stalling because he wanted to weaken revolutionary France in the face of invading forces. So exasperation with the monarchy reached its peak. In fact, National Guard units were marching on Paris anyway. As they converged on the capital before marching to the frontier, they joined with the sans-culottes to play a decisive role in the overthrow of the monarchy on the 10th of August, 1792. France became a republic. The arrest and imprisonment of the royal family deepened the resolve of European monarchies to crush the revolution. It now threatened them all. In September of 1792, a joint Austro-Prussian force crossed the frontier, breezed past the main fortified positions on the road from Paris, or the road to Paris, and set up camp mere days from the capital itself. The Duke of Brunswick, the commanding officer of the Allied invasion force, had threatened to lay waste to the city of Paris, holding the city and its residents responsible for the safety of the king and queen. But rather than intimidating Paris, it set off a panic. By this time, the prisons of Paris were filled with political prisoners, notably nobles and royal guards seized and imprisoned as defenders of the monarchy the month before. Jean-Paul Marat and others fed fears that should Paris fall to the invading army, the prisons would be opened, leaving prisoners to take revenge upon their captors and their loved ones. Sans-culottes and all good patriots were encouraged to purge the prisons preemptively before leaving for the front. For 5 days in the first week of September 1792, they did so. Some prisoners were given brief trials, others were killed without trial. But by the time the killing stopped, over 2,000 were dead. Some had been political prisoners, the presumed target of the purge. Some were common criminals. These tragic events, remembered as the September massacres, were horrifying in their scale. Popular anxieties had erupted in days of vigilante justice in the streets of Paris in September of 1792. Later that month, a victorious battle at Valmy halted the Allied invasion and forced the withdrawal of the invading army. So the revolution was saved, but at a terrible price. The terror, typically associated with the years 1793 and 1794, properly dates from these events. Because, odd as it may seem, the institutions of terror were created to prevent a reoccurrence of such events. Instead, to restore rule of law by expediting political cases and thus making popular violence unnecessary. Georges Danton would justify the new institutions of revolutionary justice with a clear reference to the September massacres, speaking of the need to free the people of the necessity of harsh deeds. New courts, called revolutionary tribunals, would try political cases, including accusations of treason. Meanwhile, surveillance committees in neighborhoods, towns, and cities were designed as outlets for popular fears. Citizens could take their suspicions and their anxieties to their surveillance committees. Denunciation, it was argued, was preferable to popular vengeance and vigilante justice. But of course, these and other measures meant dismantling basic civil liberties. The conditions that led to terror found their origins in the dynamic of royal resistance to the revolution and popular insurrection, a dynamic that goes back to the earliest days of the revolution. Doubt, mistrust, subversion prevented the institutionalization of the revolution. And as a result, everything had to be measured on its merits, but also in terms of the existential challenges that the revolution faced. This contradiction between the aims of the revolution and the means employed to defend it was explicitly acknowledged by the architects of terror. Mahat wrote of the need to organize a brief despotism of liberty, justified by the need to crush the despotism of kings. The language sounds courageous, but it can also be read as the voice of despair. If terror saved the revolution, it did so at a terrible price. After the crisis of 1792, for 2 years, the revolution would remain beset from all sides, from the Low Countries, from across the Rhine and the Pyrenees, from beyond the Alps. It was also beset by civil war as dissidents challenged the Republic, seizing power for time in major cities such as Lyon, Marseille, and Toulon, but also across entire regions such as the Vendée in the west. During these years, terror was the watchword of the government of revolutionary defense, mobilizing the resources of the nation against enemies at home and abroad. During these years, the guillotine, a mechanism thought to make death swift and painless, became the terrible proof that enemies of the revolution would be dispatched quickly and without pity. During these years, first Louis and then Marie Antoinette were put on trial, convicted, and executed. By the summer of 1794, French forces had secured the national frontier and pushed beyond, while internal opposition had been suppressed. In fact, the security of the Republic prepared the end of terror. After all, if invasion and insecurity had justified terror, military success and secure frontiers undermined it. The end of terror was signaled by the overthrow of the Executive Committee of Public Safety in July of 1794. But by then, the war had taken on a life of its own. War militarized the revolution. As French forces pushed into the Low Countries, they continued to operate as if they were an army of liberation. And surely many continued to believe that they were. With the Habsburgs, driven from the Netherlands, France established the first of many sister republics, the Batavian Republic, in 1795. When the 27-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte led an army into Austrian-held Italy, he created a series of new republics. The contradictions were not far behind. The centuries-old Venetian Republic, known as La Serenissima, was dismantled. Venice was joined with Milan, Modena, Ferrara, and Bologna in the new Cisalpine Republic. Genoa became the Ligurian Republic, while long-established Swiss republics were overrun to create a new Helvetic Republic. As for Napoleon, he never saw Rome, but French armies did, creating the Roman Republic with much fanfare in 1798. A year later, the Kingdom of Naples was replaced by the Parthenopean Republic. The militant revolution was showing its flair for the revival of Greco-Roman antiquity. In a superficial sense, the sister republics made good on the promise of liberation. In practice, the sister republics had limited autonomy. The administrations of the sister republics were populated by locals. Some were genuine enthusiasts, and some were opportunists. Just to ensure that the republics remained within the French orbit, key positions within their administrations were occupied by French administrators. It was, of course, a system that would find its echo during the Cold War in the people's democracies of Eastern Europe. The sister republics were beholden in various ways to Paris. At the moment of their liberation, they were expected to yield wealth, and they did so. Liberation came with a price tag. In June of 1796, Napoleon was able to write to Paris from Pistoia that he had extracted 2 million livres from the city of Bologna and 2.5 million from Ferrara. Liberation also yielded in-kind donations. St. Mark's Basilica in Venice lost its 4 horses, and the papal art collections were cherry-picked. The finest pieces were crated up and shipped to Paris to enrich the collections of the Louvre. Not only had war militarized the revolution, the flow of resources from conquered territories to Paris signaled France's dependence on war as a source of revenue. So, in retrospect, the cynical use of the ideology of missionary republicanism seems obvious. But I assure you, at the time, it was not. Many Europeans remained enthusiastic supporters of the French Republican mission. After all, dying republics still look like republics. When Napoleon seized power in 1799, he preserved the rhetoric of the French Republic. He took the title of First Consul, and then Consul for Life. Many European intellectuals, Immanuel Kant, Ludwig von Beethoven, persisted in seeing Napoleon as an extension of the revolution, the Enlightenment on horseback, a man whose armies would remake the world according to reason. It took the proclamation of the Napoleonic Empire in 1804 to clarify the situation. Beethoven was famously disillusioned, going back on his original intent to dedicate the Third Symphony to Bonaparte. One by one, the sister republics became kingdoms under the rule of members of the Bonaparte family, or they were annexed directly to the Napoleonic Empire. In 1805, the Cisalpine Republic became the Kingdom of Italy, with Napoleon as king and his stepson as viceroy. About the same time, the Ligurian Republic vanished when Genoa was annexed to France. In 1806, the Batavian Republic became the Kingdom of Holland, with Napoleon's brother, Jerome, as king. Napoleon himself became protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, and the Kingdom of Naples was ruled by Joseph Bonaparte. In 1808, Rome itself became a French city when it was annexed to the empire. And here's a summary. Now I'd like to shift our attention even farther afield, back across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Why? First of all, because the French Revolution extended to Latin America the drive to colonial independence begun by the American Revolution of 1776. The Napoleonic Wars, and more to the point, British naval hegemony in the Atlantic, cut off continental European powers from their colonies in the Americas. For a time, colonies in Latin America provided support for metropolitan Spain and Portugal, and even refuge. The capital of Portugal, for a time, was moved from Lisbon to Rio. But the obvious alternative was independence, especially as the revolution in France inspired alternatives to monarchy. And it provided in Napoleon the model of an inspired, even providential leader. This, too, was a model with a long history. Simón Bolívar would not be the first or the last to take inspiration from it. But I want to focus our attention on one specific case, that of Saint-Domingue, later known as Haiti, because it speaks both to the American Revolution, which we learned about last week, and to the later revolutions in the Caribbean, which we'll hear about from my colleague Ileana Rodriguez Silva in just a few weeks. Above all, the example of Haiti reminds us that the French Revolution was one in a trio of revolutions of the late 18th century: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. Saint-Domingue occupied the western third of the island of Hispaniola. Hispaniola, of course, was the ground zero of European colonialism in the Americas, the first landfall of Columbus in 1492. On the eve of the revolution, Saint-Domingue was the world's leading producer of sugar and coffee. It fed the new European love for coffee, which underpinned the café culture that was a key product of the 18th century. In Europe, cafes provided a gathering place, a space for socializing, which in turn helped to sustain the explosion in ideas associated with the Enlightenment and the growth of public opinion. The growth of the coffee craze and café culture meant that by the 1780s, Saint-Domingue was the jewel in the crown of the French Empire. If the popularization of Enlightenment ideas depended upon café culture, then the revolution owed something to the colonial commodities of coffee and sugar. The labor on the coffee and sugar plantations was brought from Africa. The population of Saint-Domingue in 1789 included 450,000 enslaved persons, in addition to 30,000 French planters and 28,000 free people of color. Back in the metropole, the economies of the port cities of Nantes, La Rochelle, and Bordeaux, along with their hinterlands, drew part of their prosperity from the slave trade. By a complex dynamic, enslaved Haitians both enriched old regime France and provided the social context, namely café culture, in which its nemesis, the revolution, could take shape. When Jean-Jacques Rousseau opened his Social Contract, one of the classics of the Enlightenment, with the bold assertion that man is born free and everywhere is in chains, he wasn't offering a critique of slavery. He was using slavery as a metaphor. But anti-slavery in the Enlightenment was not merely rhetorical. Guillaume Raynal built on 18th century ideas about the mind as a blank slate to challenge notions of racial superiority that had been used to justify enslavement. He offered an uncompromising critique of slavery in his Histoire des deux Indes, published in 1770, a book seen as so dangerous that it was immediately banned. The contradictions in this system erupted into the open with the financial crisis and the calling of the Estates to Versailles. When the Estates General gathered at Versailles, 17 delegates from Saint-Domingue showed up. They showed up uninvited. As events developed, the Saint-Domingue representatives ingratiated themselves with the leadership of the Third Estate. 9 of them took the tennis court oath. Their solidarity gained them the sympathy of their comrades. But there was a troubling question, namely, how many representatives Saint-Domingue was entitled to have. The colonial delegates had been chosen exclusively from among the white plantation class of Saint-Domingue. Though they were drawn from a mere 6% of the population, they requested seats based on the total population of the colony. If that sounds familiar to us as Americans, you're ahead of me. If that sounds familiar to us as Americans, it's because it echoes the claim of political leaders of the slave states who demanded seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and electors in the Electoral College based on the entire population of their states, including enslaved persons. In the newly independent U.S., these debates resulted in the Three-Fifths Compromise, whereby the enslaved counted fractionally for the purposes of representation. In Saint-Domingue, the thorny matrix of race and freedom was complicated by the presence of men of color who were free. There were 28,000 free people of color in Saint-Domingue. They owned 1/3 of the land and 1/4 of the enslaved population. By their own account, they offered themselves as a defense against the disintegration of the slave economy. Yet they weren't represented at Versailles. So on what grounds, other than race, could they be denied political participation in the new order? The white delegates from Saint-Domingue claimed to represent not only the enslaved, but also free persons of color. And at Versailles, the deputy Mirabeau pointed out the irony of this request. The free blacks are proprietors and taxpayers, and yet they've not been allowed to vote, he noted. And as for the slaves, either they're men or they are not. If the colonists consider them men, let them free them and make them eligible for seats. If the contrary is the case, have we, in apportioning deputies according to the population of France, taken into consideration the number of our horses and mules? Mirabeau's remarks highlighted the hypocrisy of the colonial delegates, but the National Assembly was reluctant to divert its attention to a debate on the morality of slavery. A compromise granted 6 seats to Saint-Domingue, 2 for each of 3 provinces. A compromise thus unrelated to the vexed question of the population, free and enslaved. But the issue refused to go away, and France found itself responding to events in Saint-Domingue. The enslaved population of Saint-Domingue broke into open revolt in August of 1791. At first, the free people of color joined with the white plantation owners in an attempt to suppress the slave revolt, thus choosing their status as property owners over any sympathy for the enslaved. Class trumped race. Troops from France arrived in December 1791 and in April 92, the French Assembly made all free people citizens, regardless of color. This left slavery intact as an institution, but the trend was clear. If blacks could be citizens, how could they also be enslaved? Frustrated white planters turned toward London, drawing up a detailed proposal offering to transfer their allegiance to the British government in return for protection. But others embraced the cause of independence, arguing that they could only truly secure their interests by breaking away from all European entanglements. Independence alone would preserve slavery. Thus, it was the slave owners, not the rebellious enslaved, who first called for independence, seeing in independence the best way to secure their property. And indeed, France abolished slavery in 1794, and Saint-Domingue sent elected representatives to Paris. This established the battle lines of the struggle as it would unfold over the next few years, whereby association with France meant freedom, and independence meant slavery. Eventually, the population, led by Toussaint Louverture and others, would push for freedom and independence, finally secured in 1804. For both France and Haiti, the American Revolution was a source of inspiration, yet in different ways for different constituencies. For whites in Haiti, the American Revolution served as an example of how to reconcile bondage with freedom, how to win a revolution for liberty, yet preserve the institution of slavery. But as the slave insurgency grew, and as the planter class fled, the example of Haiti threatened in turn to inspire revolt elsewhere. News of the events in the Caribbean traveled fast. Refugees from Haiti, mostly whites, but also enslaved and free people of color, appeared in U.S. ports, New Orleans, Charleston, Philadelphia. The stories they told revived questions of race and freedom. And the administrations of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson took different approaches to Haiti. Adams sent an envoy to work with Toussaint Louverture, allowing the fledgling U.S. Navy to support him. Adams wanted to protect and develop commerce in the Americas, including Haiti, thinking that trade among American nations would minimize European involvement in the Americas, a position that would eventually take the form of the Monroe Doctrine. When Thomas Jefferson succeeded Adams as president in 1801, he tended to see Haiti as a threat to the plantation economy in the U.S. When Haiti became fully independent from France in 1804, Jefferson adopted a policy of diplomatic isolation for Haiti that would last until the 1860s and the American Civil War. This offers us a fitting place to end tonight's reflections, because by taking us back to the U.S., it encourages us to think of these three revolutions, U.S., France, and Haiti, as part of an ongoing Atlantic dialogue, part of a single Atlantic revolution. And by halting on the eve of the American Civil War, it reminds us that the promise of the Atlantic Revolution remained unfulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray. That was terrific. I'm not sure if I have power here. I'll use my lungs. While you're handing in your cards with questions on them, I would like to interpose briefly and ask you a question from my experience. Ray, you suggest that the American, French, and Haitian revolutions can be seen as part of a broader Atlantic revolution. I'm curious, what do you do with Ireland? You should have seen it coming. In 1798, as you probably know, more Irish men and women were slaughtered by the British government in a sort of mindless, punitive operation than died in the entire French Terror. Would it make sense to include Ireland in this triumvirate, making it something larger?
Yes. And maybe here I can offer an apology by pointing out that one of the challenges of doing a lecture on the French Revolution in 50 minutes, something I normally have 10 weeks to do, is that it's more a matter of throwing things out. But yes, the Irish Revolution, in fact, the French, Ireland is an interesting case because it in some ways extends the idea of the proxy war of starting with 1776. And extends it, pushes it across the channel to Ireland. That is, using Ireland as a way of doing mischief,
a stepping stone,
and distracting the British, and causing trouble for them.
Thank you. Some questions have begun to roll in here, and the first is: was the American Revolution more a tax revolt, i.e., a capitalistic enterprise, and the French more populist, i.e. progressive? Let me read that again. Was the American Revolution more a tax revolt and the French Revolution more of a populist or progressive revolt?
Interesting take. Richard, can I get you to come up here and answer this question? One of the risks of venturing across the Atlantic from from Europe is that I venture into territory where I'm incompetent. But I'll tell you, it makes sense to think certainly of the American Revolution as a tax revolt. I think, as Richard explained last week, it's also important to understand the American Revolution as, in part, in a very Burkean way, as an attempt on the part of British subjects to reclaim their rights from a neglectful metropole. As for the French Revolution, yes, it became a populist revolution, but the point that I was making in the first part of my talk was to suggest that, in fact, it really was an elite revolution. And what made it a populist revolution was the fact that the king was unwilling to accept a more modest role as constitutional monarch. And it was this dynamic then of royal resistance and then popular insurrection that mobilized the people, and in fact made popular mobilization one of the qualities, one of the characteristics of the French Revolution. This was by no means a matter of design or by any means baked into the French Revolution from the outset. I mean, I think Arthur Young was right. June 1789, it seems to be over. Yeah. The reason it's not over then has to do with the specific choices made by individuals in key positions.
Right. To whom did the French owe its debt, or their debt?
Good question. So the monarchy...
and what happened to the lenders, by the way?
That's an excellent question. In fact, much of the debt, some of the debt is owed, of course, internally. A lot of it comes from the Low Countries. But the monarchy was keen not to renege. One of the reasons why the monarchy got into trouble was by deciding that it needed somehow to honor these debts, and the way to honor those debts was by increasing revenue rather than by, what's the current term, giving investors a haircut. So that's what launched the process of reform that eventually became, of course, a revolution. It's a really good question because it gets to the issue, well, then how exactly was this problem solved? Because the debtors, the creditors didn't go away, and the debt didn't go away either. The answer is an important part of the revolution that I couldn't really talk about. But one of the things that the National Assembly did was to accept the debts of the monarchy as part of its responsibility. So they say, we're going to write a constitution, and by the way, we're going to assume the debt load of the nation, because we are the nation. That was a brave thing to do. You could say it was the right thing to do. It was the responsible thing to do. But for the revolution, it was a heavy burden, because it meant that the very destabilizing debt, the debt that had undermined the old regime, could very easily undermine the new regime, the revolution itself. The solution that emerged was the solution that would also contribute to resistance to the revolution. What the National Assembly did was to vote to nationalize the property of the Catholic Church. And this was orchestrated in various ways, but it turned out to be important. I mean, I want to point out that this was not the first time this had happened. I mean, remember the Reformation. Typically, the Reformation meant that in countries where the Reformation succeeded, Catholic property was seized, right? It became Lutheran or whatever. Even reforms in Habsburg Austria in the 1770s and 1780s often involved the transfer of property from the Catholic Church to the state. The difference here is that it's a revolutionary government doing it. And that would have consequences, notably in 1917. It was remarked at the time that this cavalier attitude towards private property would come back to haunt the revolution. And of course, in some ways it would. What the revolution did was to then try to monetize the property of the church. And it did solve the financial crisis for a time, but not permanently. The revolution found itself dependent upon revenue generated by conquest. And in fact, by the time Napoleon came to power in 1799, he was brought into a conspiracy in part because the political leadership knew that it needed at least one general as part of the conspiracy, because the revolution was so dependent upon the army and revenues generated by the army for its own financial stability.
And probably just time for one more question. How free was the press during the revolution at its peak?
Absolutely. Oh, at its peak. Well, what's its peak?
1793, 1794.
Okay. So a brief history of the freedom of the press, 1789 to 1793. So the press was closely controlled. If you wanted to publish something under the old regime, you needed to get, or you were supposed to get, the approval of royal censors. If you didn't get that approval, you couldn't publish legally and you couldn't enforce your copyright. That system collapsed with the revolution, and absolute freedom of the press was one of the first results of the revolution. Royal censorship ended, and it was possible to publish anything. What this meant, first of all, was that the book industry collapsed because there's no way to protect copyright. Over time, though, control of public opinion was seen as so important that by 1793 and 94, censorship becomes an issue again. And of course, publishing had its own risks, as did speech, if one spoke in a way or printed it in a way that challenged powerful people.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. That was wonderful.
Thank you.